Okay, hello, good day, and this would be the continuation of our discussion for selected kidney diseases. So let's start. So another important diagnostic test that we usually request, no, as a nephrologist would be an arterial blood gas. It aids in establishing certain diagnoses because there are certain diseases that would manifest with certain primary acid-base abnormality, or sometimes there could be problems in the oxygenation of that individual. It also helps us in guiding treatment plan, depending on the acid-base abnormality, using the clinical data that we also get, in determining the cause of that abnormality. If it's a primarily a oxygenation problem, it aids us, particularly what ventilator management, or how do we assist in the patient um, in order to get an adequate amount of oxygen in their body. So usually there's a heparin infused here in the syringe, and then um, an arterial pulse. No, it's a much more difficult extraction as compared to the venous, uh, and an indication that you get an arterial blood is it is a relatively bright reddish in appearance. No, unlike blood extracted from the venous blood, which is relatively dark because it primarily is a deoxygenated blood. So that's one way of showing, no, that you got an arterial blood, because if it's a venous blood, definitely it won't be helpful in interpreting a correct acid-base abnormality for that patient. So there could be errors definitely in um, reading or analyzing the arterial blood gas. Um, Hopefully, patient identification errors are avoided because those are preventable types of errors. There could be contamination of sample. For example, a dilution by. Sometimes you can also get samples from an arterial catheter if the patient has a vascular catheter. But usually that vascular catheters are protected, or it there is heparin already, that or antibiotics that are given to prevent one, thrombosis, two, infection in that vascular catheter. So there could be contamination of sample if we get an arterial blood sample from vascular catheters, which would lead to inaccurate values. There could be excess heparin infused in the syringe in which the extraction was made. So there could be again dilution, and it would also affect the measurement of the parameters that we're trying to collect. Blood hemolysis is also another problem because there could be a release of certain components, no, in the red blood cells, and that could lead to errors in the measurement of certain parameters as well. Air bubbles in specimen, which might falsely elevate um, oxygen values and lowers um, the arterial carbon dioxide pressure. There's also delay. So usually when if the analyzer is on a relatively distance, no, from where the patient is located, the syringe wherein the blood has been collected should be placed in a small cup with the ice water so that it does not metabolize, because there's an ongoing metabolism that could happen, which would increase the carbon dioxide values and lowers down the oxygen values. So, and as much as possible, you analyze the extracted arterial blood right away. Machine Machine would also have some sources of errors, a calibration error, interferences, and yung measurement methods, no, depending on the machines that is available. So those are some of the factors that you have to rule out so that you would get an accurate analysis of your arterial blood gas. So these are the parameters that we measure or that is released in an arterial blood gas. The arterial pH, which is, as you learned, it's 7.35 to 7.45. So it's a very narrow normal range. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide, 35 to 45 millimeter mercury. The partial pressure of oxygen is 80 to 100 millimeters mercury. The serum bicarb is 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter, and the base excess of -2 to +2. So in order to now once you have the results, in order to interpret, you have, again, it's very important to contextualize it in the clinical information of your patient. So getting a detailed history and physical examination is very important. And it's very important also to get at the same time a serum sodium, potassium, and chloride. So that would be very important in the interpretation of the ABG as well. And then you have to check, no, besides the visual inspection. And another indicator, if it is a venous blood, if the PaO2 is relatively low in a patient that doesn't seem to have any signs of respiratory symptoms. So that may also give a relatively high PaCO2. So that would also be an indicator, no? Unless the patient has a primarily respiratory symptoms, then it would be a bit difficult. So the next step would be checking the internal validity of the sample. So you would get this formula. So the serum concentration of the hydrogen ion equals the 24 times the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide over the serum bicarbonate. So as you can see here, okay, so for every particular pH, there's a corresponding concentration of hydrogen ions in the body. So it's very important that the concentration of the hydrogen ion is consistent with the pH that was determined in the analysis. So, and then, so if the hydrogen concentration is consistent, no, with the pH, you have to check the pH. So if it's less than 7.35, it's acidemia. There's an increased acids in the blood. If it is more than 7.45, it's alkalemia. And then you check primarily the two parameters, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the bicarb. So it could be elevated, decreased, or still within the normal range. If it is abnormal, depending on the direction, so for example, if the direction of the abnormality of the PCO2 is in opposite direction with the pH, it is a respiratory abnormality. But if the PCO2 abnormality direction is the same with the pH, it's metabolic. So if, for example, so the PCO2, for example, is 60. So it is elevated compared to the normal of 35 to 45. However, the pH in this patient is 7.3, which is decreased. So decreased pH, elevated PCO2. So that is a respiratory acidosis. Conversely, if for example, the PCO2 is 20, and on a pH of 7.3. So there is a decreased PCO2 and a decreased pH. So they are both in the same direction. So therefore, it is metabolic acidosis or acidemia. Now, if the bicarb now is the one that has abnormality, it's the same. If So for example, the the bicarb is elevated at 30 megs per liter, and the pH of the individual is 7.50, which is greater than the maximum normal of 7.45. So elevated bicarb and increased pH, so they are in the same direction. So it is a metabolic alkalosis. But for example, the bicarb is elevated again at 30 megs per liter, and the pH is 7.25, which is decreased. So there is an opposite direction, an increased serum bicarbonate and a decreased pH. So they are in opposite direction. So it is a respiratory alkalosis. And now, depending now on the primary abnormality, if it is a respiratory or metabolic, you have to determine if it is an acute or chronic. That would now depend on the history and physical examination, on what you think is the cause of the respiratory acid-base abnormality, because you have to check the change in bicarb divided by change in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So you get the you get these values. So if it is less than zero point 0.3, it's chronic. Zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.8 is acute on chronic, and if it is more than zero point 0.8, it's acute. You also check the PO2. So again, the normal value is 80 to 100 millimeters mercury. So that's the normoxemia. If it is 61 to 80 millimeters mercury, it's mild hypoxemia. 41 to 60 is moderate hypoxemia, and less than 40 is severe hypoxemia. And then now, once that you've identified the primary acid-base abnormality, you have to check for compensation. So now the compensation depends on the acid-base abnormality. So for example, if it's metabolic acidosis, so there is lower serum bicarb, primarily a low or decreased serum bicarbonate in an acidic pH. So the body tries to compensate it since the bicarbonate buffer system is ineffective due to deficient bicarb. So another acid-base buffer system is the respiratory pathway. So now the individual hyperventilates in order to um, decrease PCO2 by increase carbon dioxide excretion. Conversely, in metabolic alkalosis, since there is excessive bicarbonate, now you want to counteract that with increasing your PCO2 by lowering the respiratory effort of that individual. Yung respiratory acidosis, so increase PCO2, which could be a source also of organic acids. So there is an increase. So now it's the kidneys now that is trying to compensate for the respiratory problem by increasing reabsorption of sodium bicarbonate and excretion of the hydrogen ions by the kidneys. And in respiratory alkalosis, since there is excessive um, and there's an elevated pH. So you don't need the bicarbonate much in this situation. So you have to decrease the reabsorption of bicarb and also decrease the excretion of the hydrogen ions in order to lower down to the pH into the normal levels. And you have to, so those changes in the compensation would have an expected increase or decrease of these parameters depending again on the primary acid-base disorder. So you have to memorize this table. Okay. Very important concept also is an ion gap. So what is an ion gap? So remember, there is a concept of electron neutrality. As I've discussed it in the first part of our lecture, wherein the body has an equal amount of cations and anions in our body. So, but, so again, the majority of the cation um, extracellularly. Remember, because we're getting the blood, so it primarily reflects the um, um, extracellular electrolytes. So it's sodium. And then the major anion would be primarily chloride and also bicarbonate. And second would be bicarbonate. So, but in addition, there is what you call an unmeasured anions. So these are the albumin, other organic acids, which the arterial blood gas cannot measure or cannot analyze in the analysis of this machine. So so there is a normal, what you call a normal anion gap, no? Even in healthy individuals, because those anions are not measured. But if you would take that into consideration, the amount of anions plus the amount of chloride and bicarbonate is um, relatively in the same amount as the amount of the cations, which is primarily the sodium cations. So to check the anion gap, so it's just the difference of the cations, primarily serum sodium, and the sum of the anions, the chloride and the bicarb. So that's why it's very important to get serum sodium and serum chloride also when um determining or analyzing the arterial blood gas. So the normal anion gap would be 8 to 12. However, a high anion gap is more than 12. There's no such thing as a low anion gap. So it's either a high anion gap or a normal anion gap. So if there's high anion gap, you check for the delta ratio, which is the delta anion gap divided by the delta in the bicarb. So this one would be the actual anion gap minus 10, and then the absolute value of the actual serum bicarbonate minus 24, which is the middle value of the normal serum bicarbonate. So it depends now on the ratio or the quotient that you derive from this the equation. You would determine if it is a pure non-anion gap metabolic acidosis. If it is between 0.4 to 0.99, it's mixed high anion gap and normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. 1 to 2 would be a pure high anion gap metabolic acidosis. And if it's more than 2, it's high anion gap metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. So now, high anion gap metabolic acidosis are very significant, has significant clinical causes. So, methanol, uremia, diabetic ketoacidosis, paraldehyde, isoniazid, which is an anti-TB drug, lactic acid, particularly in sepsis, ethanol, and salicylate. So, particularly mga sulfa-containing drugs such as aspirin. So, what the although they may have different biochemical pathways, what is in common with them is that these acids are relatively anionic. So they are anionic acids. Therefore, it's like they're taking over now the anions in the blood, okay, causing to lower down primarily the bicarbonate, because these acids also try to react, no, with the bicarb in order to it's a buffer, it's as part of the buffer system, but then eventually the bicarb can be depleted in these certain clinical scenarios, and therefore there is an increase acid production from this following causes, which they are not measured in the ABG and in the serum electrolyte determination. Therefore, that would account for the high anion gap or unmeasured anions in the blood. Meanwhile, this one, you can have a metabolic acidosis, but the anion gap is still maintained in the normal range. So the bicarb may be depleted, but in these cases, what takes over would be primarily chloride. So there will be an increase in the serum chloride in order to counteract the decreased bicarbonate because of the acidosis, because of the depletion of the bicarb, no, as part of its response, no, as a buffer system in a situation that would lead to acidosis. So hyperalimentation, acetazolamide, which is a um, carbonic anhydrase inhibitor, amphotericin, antifungal, renal tubular acidosis, diarrhea, ureterosigmoidostomy, which is a surgical procedure that would connect the ureters and the colon, which might cause also increase stool loss, post hypocapnic state, and small bowel fistula. So hard ups, yun yung ano. And then yung high anion gap is mud pie. So yun yung mnemonics just to remember yung cause, no, of high anion gap and normal anion gap. Now, if it is metabolic alkalosis, so there could be a chloride responsive alkalosis and unchloride unresponsive alkalosis. So vomiting, nasogastric tube suctioning, are there previous use of loop or thiazide diuretics, post-hypercapnia and cystic fibrosis. Well, the chloride unresponsive alkalosis would be Cushing syndrome, Gietelman-Bartter syndrome, which we'll be discussing later, current use of loop or thiazide diuretics, refeeding syndrome, no? Especially if the patient has been on nothing per orem or not given an actual food for a long time, and you would now reintroduce oral feeding or enteral feeding to an individual, and exogenous steroids as well. So respiratory acidosis, it's primarily caused by the usually disorders in the respiratory system. So it could be sedatives or some disease state or medications that would lower the respiratory drive. It could also be due to airway problem. It could be due to interstitial lung diseases. It could be due to a neuromuscular diseases that could also affect the mechanics of respiration for individuals. Other thoracic complications, particularly in the chest wall, in the pleura, and the lung parenchyma, and shock states such as sepsis and circulatory shock and malignant hyperthermia. So saints. So it's easy to remember just to simply remember the basic cause of respiratory acidosis. How about respiratory alkalosis? CHAMP. So it's cirrhosis, heart failure, anxiety, mechanical ventilator. Sometimes the settings for the mechanical ventilator is already excessive and it's already causing decreased PCO2. P would be pneumonia, and S would be again sepsis. So those are those are the most common causes, but there are also other causes as well, as you can see here in this slide. So let's take an example case. Let's move here. Okay, so 80-year-old woman in the emergency department with a COPD exacerbation. So it's relatively a straight out respiratory problem. With these vital signs, the patient is markedly tachypneic, slightly tachycardic at 105, can speak only in words with tight airway entry and auscultation. So these are your laboratory findings. So this is serum creatinine, bicarb, pH, PCO2, PaO2, and then the electrolytes as well. So, oops, okay. So now you just have to check the validity first again. So again, 24 times 70, which is the PCO2, divided by the bicarb, 23. So it's 73.04. And as you would again see in the table earlier, so yung 7.1 pH corresponds to a hydrogen ion concentration of 79. 7.15 corresponds to 71. So the value, since 7.14 is in between or more on near the 7.15 and 73.04. So in a way, no, if you would look in terms of approximation, it is consistent. So therefore, this sample is a valid specimen for ABG analysis. Now, we know that the pH is 7.14, so it's acidemia. And if you would determine the trend, the bicarb is normal. However, the PCO2 is elevated at 70. And then with the low pH and with an elevated PCO2, so opposite directions, therefore it's respiratory acidosis. Now since we know that the primary disorder is respiratory acidosis, now hopefully the compensatory mechanism would be an increase in serum bicarb or metabolic alkalosis. So now but before that, we have to determine first if it is an acute or chronic. So we compute for the delta hydrogen ion over the delta partial pressure of CO2. So the computed earlier, 73.04 minus 40. So that's the constant value. And then the PCO2 of 70 minus 40, which is again, the middle value of the range of normal PCO2. So the answer is 1.1. Therefore, it is an acute respiratory acidosis. If you would come to think of it, since there's also a clinical clue because the COPD exacerbation probably be just a few hours or at most in 1 to 2 days. That's why it's an acute acid-base abnormality, an acute respiratory acidosis. And then the PCO2 is 60. So now, so it's markedly low because the normal is 80 to 100 and 60 is moderate hypoxemia. So now we know the patient has an acute respiratory acidosis and moderate hypoxemia. Now again, going now for the compensation. So the acute respiratory acidosis, you use this formula. Okay, so the table that I mentioned that you have to memorize. So the change in bicarb, so the increase in bicarb, so zero point 0.1 times the actual PCO2 minus 40, so zero point 0.1 times 30, so it's 3. So if you would expect the compensated value from 24, again, the middle value of um, the range of normal serum bicarb, so 24 plus 3 is 27. However, the actual is 23. So it's not, while it's normal, it's not elevated. So therefore, it is an uncompensated respiratory acidosis with moderate hypoxemia. So that's the analysis of that ABG. So one of the common diseases wherein we request for ABG is, besides chronic kidney disease, is an acute kidney injury, which is defined as sudden and often reversible reduction in kidney function as measured by increased creatinine or decreased urine volume. So you've learned from the last meeting, we use urine and serum creatinine as our markers, primary markers for kidney function. So definitely there's no deviation here from acute kidney injury. But it's more of the volume now, as the primary urine parameter that we check for determining the severity of an acute kidney injury. It is a heterogeneous disorder. So it does not cannot be explained only by one mechanism. It's usually due to multiple mechanisms with a particular primary etiology, very common in hospitalized patients and in critical care settings with short and long-term morbidity and mortality. So locally, the incidence can go as high as 50%, especially those, as I mentioned, the patients with sepsis, severe burns, and recently, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was also an increase incidence of acute kidney injury among the patients infected before. There is some differences of what is the clinical picture among high income or developed countries and in the low to middle income countries such as in our country. Um, in the developed countries, it's primarily in the intensive care unit or the critical care cases. But in in our setting or even in our neighboring countries, even in the typical non-critical settings in hospitals, we see a frequency or a prevalence or incidence of acute kidney injury. And definitely, it's associated with multiple organ failure. For low to middle income countries, it's usually yun nga, no, ay primarily a single etiology. Although multiple organ failure can still happen, but it's relatively uncommon. Acute kidney injury is more common in elderly, but in our setting, there's a significant percentage of healthy children and young people. So, for example, in leptospirosis and other infections, there is in which the younger age group are affected can lead to a complication of acute kidney injury. So there is increasing incidences. The problem again is severely underreported in our country, while it's adequately reported in high-income countries because of their record keeping and the electronic medical records that they've been using. Still, it's still difficult to prevent because the problem, again, in the developed countries is that they are mostly elderly people. But for the low to middle income countries, what is so depressing would be these AKI cases that we encounter are preventable cases. It just need to have public health initiatives. So, like for example, the leptospirosis that I mentioned. So that could have been prevented, no? Because now in connection with the flood control, etc. So there are so many factors, no, in the health that so the flood control scandal goes beyond corruption, but it also has health implications, and it could cause severe complications in young people, particularly acute kidney injury, that would have devastating consequences. Well, it's still expensive to treat because sometimes you would need um to have dialysis or renal replacement therapy. For low to middle income countries, I don't believe it's inexpensive. It's also very expensive, even if dialysis is not required. Main exposures, again, sepsis, primarily from pneumonia, trauma, major surgery, nephrotoxic drugs, and burns. So again, the infections would be very prevalent as the cause of AKI in our setting and in developing countries. OB-related uh, diseases, preeclampsia, for example, HELP syndrome, animal venoms, particularly in the rural areas, and yung mga prolonged physically demanding work, no, in unhealthy environment. So now, how do we classify AKI? So again, serum creatinine and urine output. The caveat here is that you have a known baseline serum creatinine for this individual prior to the particular consult or admission in order to compare. So, for example, okay, so the let's say about 5 months ago, the patient was in the clinic and the serum creatinine is 1 milligram per deciliter. The patient suddenly developed infection. You determine the serum creatinine, and the result is 1.5 milligrams per deciliter. So if you would take the ratio, there is an increase of times 1.5 in that ratio from 1 to 1.5. So therefore, the patient is described as having stage 1. But if, for example, um, with the baseline of 1 milligram per deciliter of serum creatinine, but the serum creatinine is 4.5, so it increased by 4.5 times. So therefore, it's greater than or equal to 3. So it is a stage 3 acute kidney injury. Or it again, a serum creatinine of more than 4 milligrams per deciliter can you can already label this patient as a stage 3 AKI. Urine output, the problem here is that sometimes it's very unreliable even in history. Sometimes they would say that um, the individual hasn't urinated for 6 hours. Sometimes you can use that as a parameter also, but it's very important to monitor also accurately the actual urine output when the patient is already in the healthcare setting. So more than 6 hours of oliguria or anuria, so that is defined as less than 0.5 ml per kilogram per hour. So yung 30 ml, so if for a 60 kilogram individual, so if the urine output is less than 30 ml per hour, so that's already oliguria. Worse, if there is no urine output hourly for 6 hours. So anuric na siya for 6 hours. So it's stage 1. But if it's oliguria for 12 hours, stage 2. But if it's already more than 24 hours, or the patient is already anuric or no urine output for 12 hours, so stage 3 na rin yun. So the AKI can be classified in stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3. So that's the most severe. This one would be the outcomes after the patient, depending on the clinical course of the patient, depending if the abnormality in the serum creatinine or the urine volume would still persist or resolve. So there are three main causes of acute kidney injury: the pre-renal, the intrinsic, and the post-renal. So pre-renal, definitely it's meaning before the kidney. So the primary mechanism for a pre-renal AKI is there is a compromise in the blood flow to the kidneys. Remember, kidneys um, get 20% of the cardiac output. So any decreases no, in the blood perfusion going to the kidneys would have a tremendous response. And in order to uh, hopefully compensate and restore yung good blood perfusion of to the kidneys. So if there is a decreased arterial blood volume, there's a sympathetic response wherein there's an increase in catecholamines by increasing its heart rate. There's an increase in the antidiuretic hormone causing vasoconstriction, as well as there's also decrease, no, there's an active increase, there's an activation of the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. In the kidneys, there would be increased efferent arteriolar resistance, increase in the aldosterone to increase tubular sodium reabsorption. There's increased proximal tubular sodium reabsorption, and definitely water follows, no, by virtue of osmosis. So there is regulation that happens, so that there is a maintenance no of the blood perfusion or renal blood flow in a normal mean arterial pressure. But if there is a decline in the mean arterial pressure, this responses now is triggered or activated. But sometimes the response again, depending on the inciting agent that lead to the effective arterial blood volume. If that is not responded to, it, these responses can only compensate for a particular time. And definitely it would lead to retention of metabolic waste, leading to increase in serum creatinine, or there is a decline in the urine production, leading to oliguria or anuria. So in addition, depending on the etiology of pre-renal acute kidney injury. So for example, in liver cirrhosis, malnutrition, when there is decreased protein, there's a decreased plasma ocotic pressure leading to extra fluid extravasation, which is usually manifested by edema. Um, Sepsis, anaphylaxis, or pancreatitis, this causes increase in vasodilatory molecules, lowers down the systemic vascular resistance, and lowers the blood pressure, leading to hypotension. GI losses, it's the same. There's also decrease in intravascular volume. Excessive mechanical ventilator is also part of the pre-renal. Again, too much strong settings of the mechanical ventilator also leads to decreased venous return, lowering down the stroke volume and the cardiac output. The heart failure as well directly lowers down cardiac output because it's poor contractility. But in the end, all of them would lead to a decreased renal perfusion, leading to a pre-renal injury. So one example would be also renal artery stenosis, which is the most common cause of secondary hypertension. So what happens in renal artery? So there is stenosis. So there is a um, narrowing, no, of one of the particular area or segment in the renal artery. So because of that, it leads to a decreased renal blood flow. It triggers the juxtaglomerular apparatus, leading to the activation of the RAAS and the sympathetics, as we mentioned. It leads to renovascular hypertension because of the sodium and water retention that happens as part of the activation. It could lead also to heart failure and acute coronary syndrome. It's it's either atherosclerotic in nature, which is the most common, and the second most would be fibromuscular dysplasia. So in patients with sudden elevated hypertension, if the hypertension is very excessive and is resistant to hypertensive agents, for example, you already have three, four, or five different classes of antihypertensive medications, and still it is not controlled, you need to consider, especially in young individuals, less than 40 years old, you have to consider renal artery stenosis as a possible cause. So you can diagnose this by arteriogram, a magnetic resonance angiogram, or the Doppler of the renal artery. So if there's excessive, so definitely you can start with management first, giving antiplatelets and diuretics in addition to the standard BP lowering regimen and also statins. But if it is severe or unresponsive to medical management, renal artery stenting, so that the narrowing will be resolved by placing a artificial tube that would make the renal artery lumen patent and ensures good renal blood flow in the system. Cardiorenal syndrome is also very important because there is a decrease any decrease or any affectations in the cardiac activity lowers down the cardiac output, which leads to decreased effective arterial blood volume in the kidneys. So there are five types of cardiorenal syndrome. The type 1 would be there is an acute or rapid worsening of the cardiac function that led to the AKI. So in cases of acute myocardial infarction, cardiogenic shock, acute decompensated heart failure, or even acute valvular diseases can cause AKI. Yung type 2 meanwhile are chronic problems in the heart that led to chronic kidney disease. So, um, chronic inflammation, the activation of the RAAS and the sympathetics that are it's unchecked. So, type 2 cardiorenal syndrome is the appropriate label. The third one would be renocardiac. So the kidneys can also cause heart problems. So if there is an acute decline of the renal function, it could lead also to the dysfunction in the heart. So the increasing serum creatinine or metabolic waste causes impaired contractility. The potassium is not adequately excreted by the body, leading to hyperkalemia, which can lead to dysrhythmias and volume overload because of inability to produce urine in the body. Then it could lead to pulmonary edema. Type 4, meanwhile, is those with chronic kidney diseases that led to a heart disease. So right now, chronic kidney disease now is a recognized risk factor for coronary artery disease. So definitely all CKD patients are at risk of developing cardiovascular diseases because of multiple mechanisms, no? Including the retention of the nitrogenous or metabolic waste due to its inability to be excreted by the kidneys. The type 5 would be the systemic disease that led to both cardiac and renal dysfunction. So very common would be sepsis and diabetes mellitus. So it's a multi-mechanism, multifactorial trigger that led to both problems, no, in the heart and in the kidneys. So, example would be yan, yung acute decompensated heart failure, there's underfilling and activation of the sympathetic and the RAAS leads to the efferent arteriolar vasoconstriction, and then there's an increased venous pressure leading to decreased perfusion pressure leading to AKI. Intrinsic, meanwhile, meaning these are diseases within the kidney that led to the sudden decline or shutdown of the kidney function. So usually regardless of the cause of the intrinsic renal disease, the common pathway here is there is renal ischemia. So while there could be an adequate blood flow to the kidneys, but the distribution now of the blood flow to the kidneys is ineffective, leading to which leads to ischemia. And it has certain vascular effects that leads to increased endothelial injury. So there is the increase of these cytokines leading to a decline in the glomerular filtration rate. Couple that with increasing cytosolic serum calcium in the afferent arterioles. So there is also increased vasoconstriction of that afferent arteriole, impairing the autoregulation that I mentioned earlier. Inflammatory mediators are also increased, which also leads to increase in oxygen radicals, which also leads to decrease or the decline in the glomerular filtration rate. Usually the most common cause would be acute tubular necrosis. So it has multiple causes. So the most common would be yung mga septic shock and hypovolemic shock. So what happens is, for example, in septic shock, there is the decline of blood pressure leading to a decreased renal blood flow. So the one that's first affected would be the proximal tubular cells. So there is the necrotic proximal tubular cells fall into the tubular lumen. So this cellular debris can obstruct the tubules, which could lead to a decline in the GFR, activating the RAAS. RAAS, it can also be activated by a decline in the GFR, leading to aldosterone release, reabsorption of sodium in water, increasing the urine osmolality. If it's not addressed, there is a progressive deterioration of the kidney function, which leads to a reduced urine production. Increased reabsorption of sodium in water causes intravascular fluid expansion as manifested by edema and hypertension. Again, if it's not adequately addressed, now the tubular system now starts to be affected. So there is increased urine production, or there could be excess loss of electrolytes and water because of the tubular dysfunction. Now, depending on what happens, it's either the function normalizes or there is a further decline of the kidney function. So that is the common pathway here. No? Either a direct injury to from these substances, as seen here, or there is a decreased renal blood flow. So very important here, some medications can lead to um, ischemic toxic acute kidney injury, ethylene glycol, okay? Remember the calcium oxalate, the crystal in the urine microscopy, contrast medium in radiographic testing, rhabdomyolysis in for example in mga earthquake victims and ano that are stuck and nadaganan ng for example a concrete, so and mga patient, and then very uncommon but expected scenario also would be yung mga fraternity or yung mga hazing victims because of yung excessive trauma, no, in the muscles leads to increased muscle breakdown, leading to increase in myoglobinuria, which could also be cause direct nephrotoxicity or cause um, obstruction also in the tubules, because those pigments can be excreted also by the kidneys because it's a water soluble. Myoglobin is a water soluble pigment. Hemolysis, tumor lysis syndrome, especially um, these are usually typical in cancer patients that had their first cycle of chemotherapy and in complicated gout as well. If the patient has an acute gouty attack, a severe acute gouty attack. So, intrinsic renal failure can be glomerular, tubular, interstitial, and vascular. So we'll discuss some diseases, no, under these four types of um, intrinsic renal failure. So these are essentially the basic parts of the kidney: the glomerulus, the tubules, the interstitium, and the blood vessels. So but before that, again, I mentioned yung contrast-induced nephropathy, which is due to a direct toxicity from the contrast, which is excreted by the kidneys. So there are risk factors. If the patient has pre-existing chronic kidney disease, patient is diabetic, elderly, patient has been taking also medications that are potentially nephrotoxic, there is poor hydration status, congestive heart failure, and again, yung excessive volume of contrast media, the use of hyperosmolar contrast media, multiple exposures in short term are also risk factors that can lead to contrast-induced nephropathy. So the definition is more or less the same with the cutoff value of the staging of acute kidney injury. So an increase of, but here it's, some would define it as increase in serum creatinine of more than 25%. So for example, again, baseline of 1 milligram per deciliter, naging 1.3, which is about 30% increase. So it's more than 25%. So it's most likely a contrast-induced nephropathy. Very uncommon. This is what is uncommon here is that it won't present with oliguria or anuria. So this is a non-oliguric type of an acute kidney injury. So what happens is that due to the contrast, especially yung mga hyperosmolar uh, contrast agents, they cause vasoconstriction in the afferent arteriole, leading to the influx of calcium, release of these um, pro-inflammatory substances like endothelin. There's impaired vasodilation. So that leads to the hypoxia in the medullary area, in the tubules. There's the contrast can also lead, and because of the inflammatory cytokines can also cause direct tubular toxicity. And eventually there would be vasoconstriction and impaired vasodilation in the blood flow also of the other parts, which would lead to decreased nitric oxide production and increased production of the free oxygen radicals. So this is not usually a very morbid cause. So it's very important to hydrate the patient. Like still, the most important preventive measure for contrast-induced nephropathy is adequate hydration. Oral would be preferred even a few days prior to the procedure. Um, Sometimes some physicians would give also N-acetylcysteine due to its antioxidative effect. No? So it counteracts these pathologic changes that happen because of the due to the contrast. But definitely, the use of hyperosmolar agents are avoided. The amount of the contrast should also be be minimized if possible, especially if the individual has risk factors. And you have to weigh also the necessity of putting contrast in the radiographic studies. Is it the best diagnostic tool for a particular disease that is contemplated for the patient? Are there any alternatives that can also give the good information with regards to the disease that they're trying to investigate? So, or would a contrast-free radiographic test would be sufficient in order to diagnose the disease of interest? So, those are the other things that you have to consider as one of the preventive measures in contrast-induced nephropathy. Now, glomerulonephritis is primarily the inflammation of the glomerulus. So, it has multiple causes. So, but we'll just discuss some primary glomerulonephritis in this lecture because of its due to time constraints. So, there is a spectrum of glomerular diseases. So, they have varying presentations, and even a single type of GN can have varying presentations as well from one individual to another. So, but if we would look simply as the two extremes or the two ends of the glomerulonephritis, it's either it presents as nephrotic syndrome or a nephritic syndrome. So for the nephrotic syndrome, so there's an injury to the foot process or the podocytes, and there's also changing in the architecture that leads to scarring and the deposition of the extracellular matrix or other elements in the glomerulus. Nephritic syndrome, meanwhile, is due to inflammation, a reactive cell proliferation, a breakdown in the glomerular basement membrane, and formation of what you call crescents. So, in terms of clinical manifestations, how do they differ? Acute nephritic syndrome has mild proteinuria, while the nephrotic syndrome would have a very significant amount of proteinuria. So usually these individuals would really notice that they would have a more bubbly urine. So albumin na yung cause ng bula na yon. And that could be noticed very apparent, more apparent in nephrotic syndrome as compared to nephritic syndrome. So therefore, increased protein loss in the urine, hypoalbuminemia is present in nephrotic syndrome, not in nephritic syndrome. It's uncommon. Because of that, it decreases the oncotic pressure. It leads to the deposition of excess fluid in the interstitium, leading to edema. It could be even marked that leads to ascites, pulmonary edema, and pericardial effusion. So there is a decreased plasma oncotic pressure. Still, edema can still happen in acute nephritic syndrome, but also uncommon. What's more common in nephritic syndrome is hematuria. Because of the inflammation, because of its pathogenic process, there is a release, no, of the red blood cells in the urine. So most of the time, it's a microscopic hematuria, not a gross macroscopic hematuria. The inflammation could also affect the regulation of the blood pressure, leading to hypertension. While nephrotic syndrome can also present with hypertension, but usually those are already in the severe spectrum of nephrotic syndrome. Now, because again of decreased albumin, the body tries to make albumin, but also a byproduct of albumin production would be cholesterol. So there is dyslipidemia, elevated cholesterol levels in nephrotic syndrome. Nephritic syndrome could be absent. If it is present, the patient might probably have uh, a, a different dyslipidemic pathologic process independent of the kidney problem. So that lipid can be excreted also in the urine if it is excessive. For both can present with declining urine output in addition to azotemia or elevated creatinine. Hypercoagulability can be present in the nephrotic syndrome as because of also again because of the heavy proteinuria as compared to acute nephritic syndrome. So the primary way to determine the type of glomerulonephritis is kidney biopsy. It is an ultrasound guided. So we apply first anesthesia on the posterior area, and then with the help of the ultrasound, the needle can be visualized also, and we are guided to get a small sample in the kidney. We target the cortical area. So in the ultrasound, there's a there should be there's a delineation between the cortex and the medulla. Why the cortex? Because it's in the cortex that we find the glomerulus, the glomeruli. Okay? Dun sa medulla, those are primarily the tubules. Remember, we're looking at the glomeruli because that's why it's glomerulonephritis. So there are three main tests applied in that specimen. So we use light microscopy. So we apply certain stains. So again, the most common would be ito, yung H&E staining. So it gives us the general characteristics of the renal architecture. The PAS, which would give you information about the number of glomerular cells, the basement membrane, and the mesangium. Yung Jones Silver would be important if the primary pathologic disease that you're considering would be abnormalities in the basement membrane because it gives it a blackish color if there is thickening, for example, of the basement membrane. Mason's trichrome usually leads to a bluish or greenish color if there is a problem in the extracellular matrix and the tubular basement membranes. If you're suspecting of amyloidosis, congruent staining, and for calcification, it's the von Cossa stain. And then the next would be immunofluorescence. So this is a substance, a chemical, which contains an antibody with a fluorophore. So this is like a glow-in-the-dark pigment. So you use a special type of microscope. So if, for example, that antigen is present, no, because of the glomerulonephritis in that individual, so the antibody binds to the antigen. And then, so because of that, the antibodies now is attracted to that area with antigen, and because of the fluorophore that would glow on the particular segment or part of the kidney, and also what it would also depend on what type of antibody that you um, reacted the specimen with. So it could be a direct immunofluorescence or the indirect, wherein there is a secondary antibody that is attached to the primary antibody that has the fluorophore or the glow in the dark pigment, because the fluorophore, most common reason is that the fluorophore cannot be attached, no, to the primary that particular primary antibody. So let's look first at the normal light microscopy. So this is a schematic diagram of a single glomeruli. So in a specimen, a specimen from a kidney biopsy, you would see multiple glomeruli, such as this one. But we'll just focus on one glomeruli as an example. So this is the proximal tubule. So may mga tubular cells here. Okay, so ito yon. If you can see here. And then those big spaces inside would be the capillary lumen. So may blood dyan sa loob because that's where the blood flows. And then there are the podocytes. Very important in the selective barrier in the glomerular physiology. And then the glomerular is with the Bowman's capsule and the endothelium. So in this one, the surrounding area. And then the supporting cells of the glomeruli, which are the mesangial cells. And then, not really seen clearly here, but yung importante dito is also the efferent arteriole and the afferent arteriole. And then dito yung bagdayin the distal tubules, which is also primarily contains an epithelial cells. So this is an H&E staining. So purple yung itsura. So it's normal na the, the glomerular architecture is intact, and there's no abnormality seen. So in minimal change disease, so which is the most common nephrotic syndrome among kids, no? In which there is usually idiopathic in etiology. So yung light microscopy niya is a normal appearing. So it's as if walang any marked abnormalities in the light microscopy. Since there's also no immune complexes or antigens that is uh, part of the pathologic process. So the immunofluorescence is also negative. So the antibodies that I mentioned will not attach, no, to the different parts or the segments of the glomerulus. So, but in electron microscopy, as you can see, ito yung normal actual foot processes in bigger magnification. But as you can see here, the podocytes have effaced and fused. So because of that, yung selective barrier is compromised. Therefore, it allows albuminuria or the excretion of albumin in the urine. So that's the common manifestation. No? So minimal change disease is the classical GN that presents with the nephrotic syndrome. Another one would be focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, but there is some differences in terms of its pathology, and it sometimes can also occur with the other pathologic glomerulonephritis. So, what's the difference? FSGS can occur at any age, so there's no particular age predilection. A secondary cause can be frequent in FSGS, and as I mentioned, yung minimal change is more idiopathic. There are also familial types of focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, and the immunofluorescence is also positive in FSGS. The treatment for minimal change disease, steroids are used, calcineurin inhibitors and rituximab. However, sa FSGS, steroids are not that effective. Rituximab is also rarely used. So they usually give calcineurin inhibitors or other medications or other immunosuppressants, depending on the cause. So again, it could be idiopathic, but there are infections like hepatitis C, HIV, Epstein-Barr virus, drugs or toxic agents such as impamidronate, lithium, gold, and then obesity, reflux nephropathy, and hypertension can also present with focal segmental glomerulosclerosis. So there are four subtypes of FSGS. So meron yung the perihilar, meaning the sclerosis and the hyaline deposits are near the vascular pole, so near the afferent or the efferent arteriole. The tip lesion, from the word itself, nandun sa kabilang side, the tip. So dun sa may proximal tubule end, yung sclerosis niya or yung adhesions. Collapsing now, meanwhile, is there is a collapse of yung mga vascular tufts and there is the hyperplasia of the podocytes. And then the last would be a cellular lesion wherein there is endocapillary proliferation in the middle areas with presence of yung mga inflammatory cells such as yung mga white blood cells, neutrophils in particular. So, this is just to ano lang, no? To have the same orientation. So, ito yung pole of the proximal tubule and then this is the vascular pole. So, as you can see, the the fibrosis and the sclerosis here is more marked in the perihilar area or near the vascular pole. As compared to the tip lesion, ito yung vascular pole, ito yung the proximal tubule area. As you can see here, yan. There are inflammatory changes or inflammatory cells found predominantly in that area. And then yung collapsing, as you can see, yan. So the architecture of the vascular tufts is destroyed and replaced with increased hyaline. That's why it's more markedly pinkish in color when stained in H&E. And then yung cellular, there is presence of yung mga white blood cells, as you can see here. Ayan, so neutrophils. Ayan, neutrophils. So our granulocytes are present, no, in the inside the glomeruli, which supposedly normally dapat wala. Membranous nephropathy, meanwhile, okay, so again, there are primary associated, which are usually genetic in origin, but the more common would be mga secondary types, infection, hepatitis B and C, malignancy such as in the breast, colon, or lung cancer. NSAIDs would also be a significant cause of membranous nephropathy. Autoimmune diseases, primarily systemic lupus erythematosus, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, rheumatoid arthritis, and there's also other systemic diseases as well. So, as you can see here, no, dun sa light microscopy, so there is, ito yung ano, no, yung Jones-Silver. So you can see there is thickening now of the membrane. So and the capillaries as well. Ayan. So there, itong orange line would show the capillary walls thickened. Dapat medyo mas thin. So while there are still others na walang wall thickening, but there is capillary wall thickening in most of the areas. And then dun sa white, as you can see here, may mga parang whitish speckles or spaces here. So those are the what you call the ano no the deposits or the subepithelial deposits or spikes that you can see in this microscopy. Yung ito yung immunofluorescence, as you can see, there is a particular area na nag-glow siya. So ibig sabihin The antibody bound, it's bound to that area. So this is a IgG. And then depending ngayon dun sa intensity ng staining, you can also describe the immunofluorescence finding. So for membranous nephropathy, it's a granular immunoglobulin G that goes to the particularly do sa capillary walls ng glomeruli. And in electron microscopy, yan, yung mga spaces that are shown here, if you would magnify it using the electron microscope, as you can see here, the more dense spots here in the membrane. So, yan yung mga tinatawag na subepithelial deposits or the humps. And then so ito yung mga blue arrows. The red arrow here would show yung disruption na of the food processes. So meron na ring effacement of the food processes as you can see here. Which also explains no the nephrotic syndrome commonly found in membranous nephropathy. Again, post-infectious, that's why it's very important, ano, yung post-infectious glomerulonephritis. So, post-streptococcal is a very common type of GN also found in our country. More common in kids than adults, but there are a significant cases of adult individuals that would also have this one. So primarily from pharyngitis or skin infection. You have to take note of the incubation or the incubation period before the glomerulonephritis develops. So it develops much earlier in if it is a streptococcal pharyngitis rather than a skin infection. So it's due to the group A beta hemolytic streptococcus. So because of the bacteria, there is inflammatory reaction leading to creation of an immune complex. So now that immune complex now goes to the glomeruli and would deposit in that area as well. So while it's more common in children, they have excellent prognosis, most with complete clinical recovery. Again, they would present also with nephrotic syndrome, hypertension, proteinuria, and azotemia, indicating kidney insufficiency. It could be asymptomatic, but again, edema, marked edema can be present as well with microscopic hematuria on routine urinalysis. So, since it's due to an infection, antibiotics would definitely be a cornerstone in management if it's not yet started. Supportive care must be given, and you treat any signs of edema by giving diuretics, fluid restriction. If hypertension is present, you have to lower down the blood pressure by giving primarily ACE inhibitors or ARBs because remember yung again the reactivation of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone is very crucial also in the development of the clinical features of glomerulonephritis. So it's just a electron microscopy schematic diagram here. So as you can see, yan, merong mga, again, a much more electron dense deposits here and presence of na polymorphonuclear white blood cells. So it's not much clear here, but there are white blood cells surrounding the glomeruli. And then may yan yung granular again IgG here. And ayan, yung mga subepithelial deposits that you can see here in electron microscopy. With the polymorphonuclears found also around the glomerular area. Hepatitis B is can also cause membranous nephropathy. It's the most common histologic feature, but it also can uh, have other histopathologic pictures such as seen here. No? It could also cause minimal change disease and focal segmental glomerulonephrosis in few instances. So as you can see here, so merong Again, yan, mga thickening of the basement membrane and the capillary walls. And then yan, there is a much more intense staining at the IgG. And meron pa rin mga subepithelial deposits, no? So similar to a membranous nephropathy. So may mga dense deposits also that is seen in the basement membrane. IgA nephropathy, yan, meanwhile. So another term would be yung sympharyngitic glomerulonephritis. Why? It is often triggered by upper respiratory tract infection. Because of that infection, there is IgA immune complex deposition in the glomeruli and in the small vessel wall. So it could also present as vasculitis. So pwede magkaroon ng GI problem, purpura, and for kidney problem, it could either lead to hematuria or a decline in the kidney function. So there's some slight differences, no? So yung IgA nephropathy very common in the young or the mid adults, while yung IgA vasculitis is yung mga extremes of ages, no? The pediatric age group and the elderly. IgA nephropathy is primarily renal. IgA vasculitis would have extrarenal symptoms as well. But in terms of its biopsy, it's the same in immunofluorescence. There's IgA1, but there's also some IgG, IgM, and C3 activity. There's a mesangial hypercellularity with increased mesangial matrix, endocapillary hypercellularity, glomerular sclerosis, and sometimes crescents, no? And it's more severe yung outcome nito among adults. So there is what you call the four-hit pathogenesis theory. So, for example, no, but the the virus that caused the respiratory tract infection has antigens. It goes to the mucosal epithelium. It initiates now the production of the Gdig immunoglobulin A1. Now, these antibodies or these immunoglobulins exposes the residues which act as the neoepitopes, and it triggers now the formation of the anti-glycan antibodies, which are this one, the green one. So now these antibodies, it binds also with the antigens, as you can see here. Um, they form immune complexes, and they are larger in size with higher immunoglobulin G content. Now, these immune complexes now can deposit now in the glomerulus. It would deposit in the mesangium primarily, causing proliferation and glomerular injury. So, yan. So, nakikita nyo yung hypercellularity, no, of the mesangium as represented here, yung pinkish ano, no. So, kung makikita dito, yan, yung mga deposition of the immune complexes is primarily limited sa mesangium. Yeah, it's more scattered type of immunofluorescence finding, no, as you would compare it to the membranous. So, and then yung mga yan, yung mga hypercellularity na yan, as seen here in the stars, yan, is seen much more clearer here in the electron microscope. Membranoproliferative, so ito is a combination of the membranous and increase in the inflammatory blood cells. So it could mostly infectious again, usually hepatitis B and C, but a very common cause also would be yung endocarditis and other malignancies as well, such as leukemias, myeloma, uh, liver cancer that has already led to liver cirrhosis. So as you can see here, so yeah, no, very diffused um, proliferation of the mesangium and presence of the white blood cell, various white blood cells. There is a marked deposition of the immune complexes again in the mesangium and in the membranes. And meron din presence na ng mga dense deposits, no, in the basement membrane as well. So sometimes, no, regardless of the type of the glomerulonephritis, it can lead to a rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis. So most common would be yung ANCA vasculitis, immune complex deposition, and the anti-glomerular basement membrane antibodies. Regardless of the cause, it leads to a glomerular capillary injury, increasing again the permeability of the glomerular barrier, leading to the inflammatory reaction with the production of the cells and the cytokines, leading to the activation of the podocytes, epithelial proliferation, and there are breakdown in the Bowman's capsule that abstracts the macrophages and fibrocellular cells that lead to this formation of what you call the crescents, the fibrocellular crescent. So it's made up of collagen, fibrous elements, and other cells that entered no, due to the compromise in the glomerular basement membrane. So, sa H&E staining, very intense yung purplish hue niya. I think this is the Mason trichome. As you can see, yung blue-greenish color. So, yeah, kaya it's called crescent kasi usually yan, yung yung deposition formation niya is usually parang takes the shape of a crescent moon. So, kaya crescent yung tawag sa kanya. So, therefore, no? So, sa ganyan, we do additional testing, yung ANCA, and then definitely kidney biopsy, and then yung immunofluorescence also. And we won't discuss yung mga treatment ano no because they're so in terms of its wala talaga pang any standard treatment that's used, although uh, primarily you still give steroids as a first line agent in most of these agents. In post infectious, definitely you have to give antibiotics as one of the main medications. ACE inhibitors or ARB is also given because again of the um, loss of the the ano no the podocytes. So therefore you want to minimize proteinuria. So that's why you give ACE or ARBs. So that's for glomerulonephritis. So now let's go to vascular again. So atheroembolic kidney disease. So pwede rin magkaroon ng emboli, no? Because may vascular structure din sa kidney. So there are risk factors. So the same as typical any cardiovascular or peripheral vascular disease. But very common dito na history that happens why atherosclerotic kidney disease occurs is usually iatrogenic in nature. So may nag-angiography, may vascular surgery that led to a thrombus breaking down and migrating to and stuck to a renal blood vessel, leading to an atherosclerotic kidney disease. Blunt trauma, again, in yung mga hazing cases, can also lead to thrombi formation, which could be dislodged and uh, migrate and embolize to those blood vessels also. So they would present with flank pain, elevated blood pressure, hematuria, and proteinuria. And definitely would lead to acute kidney injury. Hypercoagulability states are also those are important risk factors as well. So and yung the classic no cardiovascular risk factors as well because showers of cholesterol crystals can embolize also to the renal blood vessels. So that's that. So this time we will be looking at some tubular diseases. So, renal tubular acidosis. So, there are three main types, no? The type 1, type 2, and type 4. Yung type 1 would be primarily an impaired hydrogen ion secretion in the distal tubule. Therefore, there is an inability now to acidify the urine kasi nga hindi lumalabas yung hydrogen ion. The primary defect is in the alpha intercalated cells that fail to secrete these ions. So therefore, yung serum potassium nito is mababa. And because it fails to acidify the urine pH is more alkaline. The fractional excretion is also small. Um, yung Fanconi syndrome, meaning yung the ability to excrete excessive amounts of the electrolytes and other substances in the urine, wala, it's not present, it's not associated with. But, and then it all presents with a normal type of an ion gap. But it has significant associated complications such as nephrolithiasis, so it could cause calcium phosphate stones, nephrocalcinosis, bone disease because of the um, poor acidification and growth retardation in children. Um, Other findings could, because this could also be explained by increased calcium, urinary calcium excretion or hypercalciuria. This could be associated with amphotericin B, lithium, obstructive uropathy, and sickle cell disease. So in addition to this, yung urine pH, positive urine anion gap, uh, it could also present with a non-anion, normal anion gap in on ABG. So its treatment is alkali therapy. So you give a sodium bicarbonate or sodium citrate. If the patient has hypokalemia, you also give potassium supplements as well. Type 2, meanwhile, or the proximal, would be there's now an impaired bicarb reabsorption in the proximal tubule. So therefore, it fails to reabsorb. In bicarb is the proximal tubule would be the major site of bicarb reabsorption, about 90%. So therefore, it leads to also hypokalemia. Meanwhile, but because of its failure to reabsorb bicarb, it's more of acidic na ngayon ng urine pH in proximal uh, renal tubular acidosis. The serum bicarb could be in the near normal range, although medyo mababa pa rin. Let's say mga about 12 to 18 millimoles per liter. Unlike yung type 1 could be as low as 10 or even less, no? 10 mex per liter or millimoles per liter of serum bicarbonate. Fanconi syndrome is present. So it is associated also with osteomalacia, growth retardation, and other bone and mineral disease disorders. On the urine test, there could also be glucosuria. Um, there could also be a significant amount of proteinuria as well because of the Fanconi syndrome. Um, Medications associated here would be carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, the acetazolamide I mentioned, the tenofovir, which is an anti-hepatitis B drug, multiple myeloma, lead or cadmium exposure, and some genetic disorders as well. For treatment, alkali therapy is also needed, but a higher doses compared to the distal type of RTA. Potassium supplement is also important because it presents with hypokalemia as well. Thiazides can be given to help reduce yung bicarb requirements, but as compared to the distal type of RTA, medyo poor yung response of those with type 2 RTA. The last one would be the hyperkalemic RTA, in which the primary pathologic abnormality is there is deficiency of the aldosterone or there is a resistance in the hormone, which reduces the ammonium excretion, and therefore leads to the impaired secretion of the hydrogen ion and potassium as well. So that explains the elevated serum potassium in these cases. It does not affect yung ability to acidify urine. So the urine pH is usually less than 5.5. It has a milder acidosis as compared to the two previous ones. But because of the hyperkalemia, they can be predisposed to those symptoms associated with hyperkalemia, particularly cardiac dysrhythmias and muscle weakness. It could be connected to chronic NSAID use, excessive use of the potassium-sparing diuretics, and even diabetes as well. So in terms of treatment, you give loop diuretics to increase the potassium excretion. You give fludrocortisone as part of the treatment in order to mitigate yung aldosterone deficiency. And if there is an offending agent, have to discontinue that. Sodium bicarbonate can also be given, although in lower amounts as compared to the type 2 RTA. Tubular interstitial nephritis. So we'll discuss the acute and the chronic one. So this is an immune-mediated inflammatory condition which affects the tubules in the interstitium. So it accounts for a pretty small percentage, about 10%. And it is usually drug-induced. So the most common cause would be medications, the beta-lactams, rifampicin, sulfonamides, NSAIDs would be a very significant cause of medication-related ATIN as well. Proton pump inhibitors, diuretics, particularly in loop and thiazide diuretics, anticonvulsants, immune modulators, at saka yung mga immune checkpoint inhibitors. Okay? Infections would be the second most common cause of ATIN. So bacterial infection, viruses, and leptospirosis. Very significant in our setting. Autoimmune diseases, and particularly SLE, yung tubular interstitial nephritis with uveitis. So those are very significant causes. And some acute obstructive disorders. So it is an immune-mediated injury in which the drug or the antigen from the infection or the autoimmune disease acts as the hapten, which binds to the tubular basement membrane proteins. So it triggers a T cell response. So the CD4 and the CD8 T cells infiltrate the interstitium, causing the release of cytokines and therefore leading to tubular damage, interstitial edema, and inflammation. So there is interstitial edema and infiltration of the lymphocytes in the tubules. If you would do a histopath testing, there is inflammatory cells in the tubular epithelium as well. There's tubular injury and atrophy in severe cases or in prolonged cases. But there is sparing of the glomeruli and the blood vessels. So it's primarily the tubules that are affected in acute tubular interstitial nephritis. But it could still cause severe morbidity in these individuals. The classic triad for acute kidney injury would be for acute tubular interstitial nephritis is fever, a maculopapular rash, and eosinophilia. So it presents with AKI that rises the creatinine over a few days or weeks. So if it is usually in drug-induced, dapat it's usually 7 to 10 days after it was started. So there, weakness, flank pain, joint pains are some uncommon manifestations as well. So, acute kidney injury, uh, there could, again, it also presents as non-anion gap or normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. It could cause polyuria and also yung Fanconi syndrome, which leads to decline of most electrolytes as well. Hello?